Okay, I think we are ready to start this last session of the day. So, my name is Monica Frassoni, and we will proceed in this way. We will have, first of all, a keynote presentation from Alexis Tsipras, who is the leader of Syriza in Greece, and is vice president of the European Left Party. Myself, I am the co-chair of the European Green Party, so it's a good occasion that we had, since we never met before, to discuss with the ocean in the middle about the future of our continent. But first of all, I would like to give him the floor to talk about alternatives for Greece that, in the context that we have been talking about today, mean in some cases also alternatives from Europe, for Europe.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss the Eurozone crisis and the situation, especially in Greece, with experts and policymakers from both sides of the Atlantic. The title of this conference asks a crucial question: can the Eurozone be saved? It's interesting that such a question can be asked in Texas, because it would be difficult to ask it in Brussels or in Frankfurt. The question would be considered impertinent, even offensive, by the European Commission and the European Central Bank, as far as they will admit the Eurozone crisis is over, and so far as they claim Europe is now moving on to a new phase, to a recovery of confidence and to a resumption of growth. The question may also annoy some who understand that the Eurozone crisis is not over. It may annoy some who are experiencing the unemployment, the cuts in pay and pensions, the decline in schools and health care. There are many who are living in crisis, for whom the important question is not whether the Eurozone can be saved, but whether it should be saved. Our position on this matter is clear. The Eurozone should be saved. The Eurozone may have been a mistake. Its treaties and charters are flawed and should change fundamentally. Some say that certain countries should perhaps not have joined. We could debate these matters, but I prefer to let the historians to do that. They do not matter today. Today, the Eurozone exists. We have an economic union and a common currency, and the immediate alternatives are worse. An exit would not benefit any crisis state. On the contrary, it will trigger grave new problems: the management of an unstable new money, bank runs, inflation, flight of capital and flight of people. For this reason alone, Greece should not exit the Eurozone. But there is a second reason. An exit by Greece or any other crisis country would be a disaster for Europe. This is something that, deep down, everyone knows. For the moment, one country leaves, the markets and the speculators will start asking who is next. They will be saying to each other, as you used to say in Texas, game on. It's a process that, once started, cannot be stopped, no matter how small the departing country may be, no matter whether it leaves voluntarily or is pushed out. our European interest lies in changing the Eurozone. Here there are three tasks. The first task is to change ideas. The second task is to change policies. And the third, as necessary, is to change institutions, to change the very foundations. Today's Europe, the common market and the European Union, was founded on certain principles. Among these were no more European wars, universal human rights, a social compact, meaning a robust system of social inclusion, social insurance, public education, health and welfare, and gradual convergence of living standards of the poorer regions towards the standards of the most successful. The idea is not the new European idea. This idea is not the new European idea. It's the old European idea. And it was pushed aside years ago by an ideology of markets and competition. That's the new European idea. We call it the neoliberal idea. We say it's a suicidal idea. And against it, we stand for the traditional values of the founders of Europe. What we seek is that Europe returns to the practice and pursuit of those old values in our new situation. The rise of Syriza to power in Greece will be a decisive factor that will turn the tide in favor of the forces of democracy and growth in Europe. It will be a deep sigh for all the peoples in Europe. In that respect, we are now sure that we are not alone anymore. Austerity is now opposed by many more politicians and analysts than 2 or 3 years ago. All these forces must come together to a united front that will change the European policies. Allow me to add that the proposal for my candidacy to the position of the President of the European Commission by the Presidium of the Party of the European Left embodies this potential. It gives the proper and sole answer to the question with which policy Europe would exit the crisis. So our future government, the Syriza government in Greece, will not be alone. It's not going to be a negotiation between Greece and Germany. It's going to be a clash of the forces of growth and employment in one side and the forces of austerity and Merkelism in Europe in the other side. In front of such dilemma, social democratic parties must decide whether the handling of the crisis in Europe has been a success or not. I heard today Mr. Leterme, Yves Leterme, he admitted that during these 3 years of the crisis in Europe, from the 17 leaders of the Eurozone, of the countries of the Eurozone, now in the power are only 2 of them. So I think that this does not mean that we have a success story in Europe. But of course we have a success story for some of them. For Merkel maybe, because she is still in power, but not for the others, not for the European Union as a whole. So I said that social democratic parties must decide whether the handling of the crisis in Europe has been a success or not, and whether their future will be similar to that of the Greek Social Democratic Party, PASOK, that is around or below 5% in the polls, while it participating in the very right-wing government of Mr. Samaras. Ladies and gentlemen, the Eurozone came a generation after the European Union. It was built on the new neoliberal principles: privatization, deregulation, a rigid price stability fixated central bank, monetary union without fiscal union, no social compact at the European level, and if crisis comes, high unemployment and low wages will absorb it. These were the pillars of what we call the neoliberal consensus between conservatives and social democrats in the European Union. This was also a confederacy. It's well known that confederacies do not endure. They can, of course, survive for a time, but their growth depends on private capital flows, on sequences of bubbles, which are inherently unstable. For a time, money flows in. Local elites like this very much. They invest, speculate, hold land, and grow rich, moving part of their new wealth out of the country and away from the taxman. Local banks become the agents of much bigger foreign banks. The banks compete with each other to lend money to commercial builders, home builders, and to the state. And then the bubbles burst. This is no different from what happened in the United States, and it shares important common reasons. But in the United States has some important shock absorbers that parts of Europe do not have. For example, the state of Nevada did not have to go to the money markets to raise money in order to bail out its banks. It did not have to pay for the unemployment benefits of the newly unemployed. It did not have to pay for the costs of Social Security and Medicare that always rise during a bad recession like that. If it had to do all this without the backing of a central bank, both the state of Nevada and all the banks in Nevada would have failed. And soon after states would have followed, other states would have followed. That is what happened in Europe. So our first task is to change ideas. Our second task is to change European policy. What were the European policies in response to the crisis? Simply put, they were neoliberal policies. The United States reacted to crisis with Keynesian stimulus, quantitative easing, and universal health care. Europe reacted with large loans made to states on condition of violent austerity. The loans were passed on to banks, who then repaid their debts to northern banks, retaining a bit for recapitalization. The process deepened the bankruptcy of the states without reviving the economy or the banks. Europeans were pushed into a deep poverty, and in Greece and elsewhere, our social security system were destroyed. but local bankers remained in control of effectively bankrupt banks. This is the straits position. So today, as I speak to you, a new, let me say this phrase, a new kleptocracy is being created in my country. It uses money provided by Europe's taxpayers to the insolvent Greek state, which the state gives to Greek oligarchs for their own uses. They will never pass it on to a private sector starved or of credit and finance. In Greece, sales taxes have reached 23%. Property taxes are so high that they resemble confiscation, business collapse or leave. Professionals emigrate, and people are hungry, very hungry. The bankers, meanwhile, control the media with advertising paid for from the bailout funds. Meanwhile, their banks sink deeper into insolvency. PricewaterhouseCoopers just reported that Greek banks are facing 65 billion euros of non-performing loans, while their capital cushion is no more than 30 billion euros. And this sad situation is described as a Greek success story. That is a piece of propaganda that George Orwell would recognize, take a lie, present it as a true, use doublespeak, and keep repeating it. So let me now ask the important question. How can we save the Eurozone in a way that makes it possible for the people of Europe to dream again the dream of shared prosperity? We immediately need to address four problems. The problem with our banking sector, the problem with public finances and debt, the problem of extremely low investment, especially in the periphery, and the humanitarian crisis that we are facing now, not only in devastated countries like Greece, but also in North Europe, where poverty is creeping up, even in Germany. How do we deal with these four problems? There are simple, effective ways to do so, without creating a federal treasury, with no loss of national sovereignty, with no fiscal transfers, with no German or Dutch guarantees for Greek, Irish, or Portuguese debt, with no need for major treaty changes, with no new institutions. Here are the four elements of the program that we immediately will apply if we'll be the government in Greece. First of all, first element, debt. We believe that the ECB, the European Central Bank, can manage part of the debt of member states centrally without fiscal transfers and without violating its charter. But we should make no mistake, a long-run solution on the debt problem of European countries can only be materialized if a significant part of public debts is written off. That is why we support the idea of an international conference on public debt, like the conference that in 1953 in London. In 1953, 22 countries, including Greece, accepted the write-off of 62.5% of the German debt. This was a precondition for a prosperous Europe, and I'm sure we can prove that humanity has become wiser. So, for the debt, the great element is a cancellation of a significant part of the debt, not only for Greece, but for all European periphery countries, because we don't believe that the problem is a Greek problem, that it is a European one. The second element, banks. The European Central Bank, in association with the European Stability Mechanism, should place all banks under one authority immediately and create a single Eurozone-wide deposit insurance scheme. It can use its power to break down the local kleptocracies that are now built on the toxic bailouts, including especially in Greece. Third element, investments. The European Investment Bank can recycle European and global surpluses into new investments on a large scale, with a helping hand from the European Central Bank. It could administer a pan-European investment-led recovery program. So that is what we call a new European New Deal. And fourth element, solidarity. Europe's most vulnerable citizens need direct assistance and reason to believe in the future of Europe. Food is central, not least because it's the weapon of the national fascists who we must oppose. Europe could choose at the next European summit to use the accounting profits accumulating within the European system of central banks to fund an American-style food stamp program and also a minimum unemployment benefit scheme to alleviate the most extreme poverty anywhere in Europe. So let me say that the authors of this proposal are in this room. Yanis Varoufakis and James Galbraith. They proposed that when they were in Athens last summer. So I will not say more on this, except to add that there is a way to make the Eurozone both sustainable and good, and that Syriza government will push for such solutions at the European Union level. But let me now, before I turn to the Greek situation and to Syriza's plans for Greece, to mention the following. We are aware of the decision of the Economic Committee of the European Parliament to investigate the actions of Troika in the crisis countries. We expect to see a proper committee or subcommittee inquiry with a strong and full mandate to call upon all parties involved, including former and current Prime Minister and Minister of Finances in the crisis countries, central bankers, consulting firms, and European Commission officials. The President of the European Parliament said that somebody must be held responsible for what has happened in the countries that followed Troika's programs, Troika policies. We agree on that, and we will contribute to that direction. But the President of the European Parliament must also answer the following. If somebody, as he says, must be held responsible, why should the implementation of the program continue? I think that we need a very clear answer in this question. The people of Europe, in front of the election for the European Parliament, need and must have clear answers. Ladies and gentlemen, Greece is facing a humanitarian crisis, as I said. The Syriza government's first priority will be to address this. At the same time, we shall have a political struggle, let me say, on two fronts. The first front will be in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in Berlin. We must convince our partners there that the present course leads all of us, all Europeans, to a terrible dead end. To do this, we must first get them to talk. And they will talk if a political change in Greece has taken place and if a wide front of anti-austerity forces has had a good performance in the forthcoming European elections. The current government is trying to impress Europe by playing the role of the model prisoner. And I think that it does not work. Just look at the promises of some debt relief for Greece. For a year, it was put on hold waiting for the German elections. Now, we are being told to wait until the summer for the European elections. So the nature of this game is clear. This will stop with the Syriza government. We have the right and the duty to demand that the veil of silence be lifted, that Europe should stop pretending. And indeed, I would like to ask all of you if any one of you believe that Greece can repay 83 billion euros in interest payments until 2020 without a new loan. Without asking once again the European taxpayers fill in the black holes of bankrupt banks. I think that the answer will be, of course, no. That's why we need a new plan for Greece. And what would the plan look like? It would contain major changes for Greece's banks, for Greece's loan repayment schedule, for ways to deal with the humanitarian crisis, and would naturally include steps towards reviving investment in a way that boosts productivity and real jobs. Turning to Greece's debt and its servicing, we would invite our partners to consider a simple, logical idea that the future schedule of repayments be tied explicitly to the growth rate of the Greek economy. Central Bank's ELA program I'm sorry, I think that with this way, Europe will acquire a stake in Greece stabilization and growth. As for the minimum levels of investment that are necessary, we shall propose an idea that sensible people would accept as fair and rational. There are currently more than 10 billion euros of European structural funds that had been earmarked for Greece for the period 2007 to 2014, and which Greece has not been able to absorb because of the recession, because of the bureaucracy, and because of the failed banks. So the question is, why not pass it on to the European Investment Bank and to the European Investment Fund and instruct them to invest directly into Greek projects on pure banking principles? Finally, the new European plan for Greece should begin to deal with the human crisis in our cities, our towns, our villages. So why not use the profits of the ECB, from the European Central Bank, from its failed bond purchasing program, and of the Greek Central Bank's ELA program, to establish a solidarity fund to provide food relief and basic energy, electricity security. This is not asking too much. So as I said, the first front will be in Brussels, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, with our European partners, that we have to convince them for a new deal, for a new handling for the crisis, for a viable overcoming of the crisis, but the second front will be at home. We know we shall face the new kleptocrats, not only the conservative parties of our political system, New Democracy and now PASOK, that became a tendance of New Democracy. But we shall have to fight with the kleptocrats, with the new kleptocrats funded from bailout funds and based on the relics of the corrupt oligarchy which has ruled Greece for decades. This group knows this fight is coming. They have been busy portraying us as an anti-European, as a party that wants to get Greece out of the Eurozone, yes, that we are dangerous and extreme. Why such venom? Because a Syriza government will, in fact, end the hegemony of this group in Greece. This is the truth. This determination of ours makes them to say such lies about Syriza. Ladies and gentlemen, a few days ago, the US Treasury explained to Congress how the policies that Germany is imposing in the Eurozone are exporting recession to the rest of Europe and to the global economy. In the European periphery, we know that this is exactly right. So that it makes me feel that we can discuss the Eurozone crisis with Washington constructively. This is one reason why I'm very happy to be here today. The German Finance Ministry response to the US Treasury gives you a clue of our problem in Europe. The spokesman said, "There are no imbalances in Germany that need correction. On the contrary, the innovative German economy contributes significantly to global growth through exports and the import of components for finished products." This reply shows a lack of interest in engaging with simple logical arguments. Trade is a very good thing, but unbalanced trade is not, especially in a monetary union. I'm finishing.
No, you still have 5 minutes.
Oh, in 1 minute I will finish. So at least this is well understood here. I hope that when the time comes, a Syriza government will be able to rely on America to retain a clear perspective on these matters. In the United States, you often think that you are the country of free markets and we, the Europeans, Europe, the continent of socialists and social democrats, and a little bit of Greens. Okay.
Thank you, thank you.
I think that has not been true. The truth is that you in America have your federal institutions, social security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, deposit insurance that we in Europe do not have. And so as nation states in Europe grow weak, even the rich countries and their peoples are losing protections they could afford and once enjoyed. So I hope you will not mind me saying that the most important lesson for the United States from the Greek crisis is that it is a suicidal to try to deal with the federal debt with cuts to social protections. Basic incomes, public health provisions, public education, social cohesion, environmental protection, these are the public goods that, if depleted, will, in the end, undermine not only America's shared stability, but also its capacity to repay its debts. It's for this utterly pragmatic reason that we must defend our public goods, both in Europe and in America. Americans do not have the luxury of thinking, these things are happening in Greece, why should we care? The answer is, we must care. We face similar threats, we can learn from each other. And we are all in this together, as Lincoln said in 1862, we cannot escape history. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. So, I hope I have given you a real picture of our firm intentions to take Greece out of this spiral of disaster and to give the Greek people a chance to recover in dignity. Thank you very much.
Come back here. Thank you very much, Alexis. I think that now we will engage in an exercise that I would like to have to be more a sort of conversation among all of you and with the people of the public than a succession of speeches. And I hope that the following speakers will. I'm sure they will follow my suggestion, because Alexis, in his intervention, actually did put a lot of food for thought and for talk as well. So I will start with Mr. Richard Parker, who is a lecturer in public policy and a senior fellow at Shorenstein Center.
Thank you very much.
Richard, you have the floor. Thank
you. First, let me apologize. I have a plane to catch at 6:45, and so I will not be staying for the full panel discussion. I will be out the door shortly after 5. It's not anything being said by any of you that causes me to leave. It's just a plane schedule. I do want this to be a conversation, and I appreciated what Mr. Tsipras had to say. I also appreciate being invited to a conference on whether the Eurozone, whether Europe can be saved, although I've been at a lot of these over the last couple of years, and I've concluded that, in fact, Europe is doomed to survive. I start with that as my opening context. But I think that there is something important about providing a larger context before I turn to your remarks, and that context is the following. Europe from 1789 in the fall of the Bastille to 1989 in the fall of the Berlin Wall has represented 200 years of a bloody and very circuitous attempt to sustain the idea of democracy across the continent. By and large, that has now finally proved to be a success. Democracy can be said to exist across Europe, but it's an imperfect democracy, and the ways in which it is imperfect are the foundations for what ought to be the political discussion going forward, and it's the political discussion that ought to frame the policy recommendations rather than the other way around. My great fear is, after the experience of serving as an advisor to Prime Minister Papandreou and actually serving on the Greek team that negotiated with the Troika, the team that negotiated with the private banks, and in fact was in a number of meetings with the bankers, and so have a very jaundiced view of the global financial system as a consequence, that there is a deep dilemma at the heart of not just the Greek situation, but the European and, in fact, the global political situation. And let me describe it this way. I use the idea of Matryoshka dolls, those wonderful Russian dolls within dolls. Greece and Greece's fiscal crisis is the smallest of the dolls in this set of nested dolls. It's 2% of the European economy. Its deficit was 1/10 of that 2%. It should never have been the precipitant of the scale of crisis that we have today in Europe. One step above that tiny doll is the euro doll, and whether or not there was a misconfiguration in the design of the euro, which created a central bank that lacked the power to act as a lender of last resort and also lacked a coordinate fiscal policy regime that covered Europe. But that's not the large doll for me either. One step up from that is the deregulation of Anglo-American finance that's taken place over the last 30 years, which I think in some ways has been far more determinant of the problems of Europe than in fact the design or misdesign of the euro as such, although the misdesign of the euro as such, and in particular not the coordination of the fiscal policies, but the lack of an immediate lender of last resort capacity for the ECB, made the crisis in Europe worse. But I want to step up two more levels to two larger dolls. Beyond the Anglo-American financial architecture that's been put in place over the last 30 years is the realization that with the fall of communism, the United States is pivoting toward Asia, and that the world is in fact being globalized at an extraordinarily rapid rate, although I prefer to use the term Americanized rather than globalized, because the degree to which American business practices, American financial practices, and focus on American attributes of power are at the center of this globalization process cannot be underestimated. I think it's important to note that because then finally the largest of the dolls that I think should be at the heart of a discussion at a place like this is the decline in the values of democratic ideals and the role of democratic parties, and in particular left-of-center democratic parties across the West and indeed across the world today. There is a deep intellectual crisis that's tied to that lack of focus, that lack of purpose that would identify a left-of-center set of parties, whether in Europe or North America or much of the rest of the world. And I believe deeply that the crisis that future generations will face is in no small part growing out of that inability to create a narrative that is at one hand national and on the other hand global, that would broadly encompass what have traditionally been the values of the left in that 200-year-long struggle to create democracy in Europe. Now, the issue for me then is of trying to get Greece back on its feet, but in the process using a forum like this to provoke a larger and deeper and longer discussion about the world that we want Greece to be able to return to as a full partner. It's important to understand that in those 200 years of Europe's struggle to create stable democracy across the continent, in the last 65, since the end of the Second World War, the United States has had its hands all over Europe in one way or another in the process of leading toward democratization. And Europe seems not to be fully conscious of both the benefits and the costs of that U.S. role. The benefits are framed in terms of the Marshall Plan, and one hears today of the need for a new Marshall Plan, or one hears of the generosity of the Americans and the need for Europe, and in particular Germany, to show the kind of generosity that the United States showed toward Europe in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. But the story was always a much more complicated one. Along with the Marshall Plan came NATO. And along with NATO came anti-communism. And if you don't know, you might be interested to know that the very first order of the National Security Council, the arm of the White House charged with overseeing U.S. foreign policy, the very first order of the National Security Council was to intervene covertly in Italian elections in 1946 to block the emergence of left parties in Italy from achieving governance powers in Italy. The United States, in other words, has had multiple levels of intervention in European politics and economics throughout this 65-year period. And if Europe thinks that it can chart a direction for its member states, Greece or Germany, without full attentiveness to what it is that the Americans think is important in this new world that is emerging, in which the G2 of Beijing and Washington replaces the old bilateral world of Moscow and Washington in the terms of the Cold War, Europe had best think again. Because the fact of the matter is that the downward pressure operating on European wages and European welfare systems is the same pressure operating on the American side of the Atlantic as well. And we have to accept that until we can negotiate global deals that somehow reverse that process, Europe is not going to be able to construct a picket fence around the continent that will protect its most vulnerable members from the enormous pressures that that global downward pressure of an Americanizing economic system across the planet is going to create and has already begun to create. That then, in turn, places on the Europeans a responsibility for energizing left-of-center parties in a way, once again, that moves them away from the role in which they seem to have found themselves in the last quarter century, which is as the happier social cost accountants than the dour, austerity-minded social cost accountants of the right-of-center parties. It isn't enough to be better managers as political parties in a democratic system. There is a need to provide a democratic explanation of why we are democracies to democratic voters across the continent. And in this, I would call upon all of you at a conference like this to be attentive not only to what your professional roles are in providing policy recommendations, but the absolute necessity of recreating the language of democracy that is accessible to the whole polis and convinces democratic citizens that left-of-center parties are in fact differentiatable from right-of-center parties, to trust that there is a vision to the left of the center in Europe and North America that can be built out across the world. Because without that, you will find going on what we find in the United States and you find here, which is that voters don't trust left-of-center parties to make a difference. In the 1930s, the kinds of crises engendered by the Great Depression led to the growth of unions, led to the growth of left-of-center parties. Roosevelt was able to accomplish so much because he won re-election time and again with more than 60% of the vote. And the Democratic Party controlled 75% of the seats in the Congress throughout the 1930s. There is no state in Europe, and certainly it does not exist in Washington, that can claim that kind of unilateral left-of-center support. And I think that it's not just a failure of policy, but it is a failure of imagination. And so I credit Syriza and Mr. Tsipras with struggling in the context of Greece to find the words that would articulate democratic left-of-center policies that make sense going forward. A debt write-down of extraordinary proportions is absolutely at the center of this. Major investment funds, absolutely central, and a solidarity around issues of human suffering, absolutely essential. But Greek political leaders of the left, like European political leaders of the left, owe their citizens and one another a larger vision than the reconstruction of a peaceable small Europe at the periphery of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I think that one of the biggest challenges is actually to win the next European elections, to go in the direction you are mentioning. And a lot of the left or the progressive parties are not yet convinced that the European challenge is at least as important as the national one. And unless we are not able to go in that direction, we are probably going to win at national level, but we're going to lose a European battle. And you can be federalist or not, But that is the next challenge, I think. Okay, then I would like to retake the order that we of intervention. I would like to give the floor to Landon Thomas.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and keep it short again and focus on what I've been looking at recently in Greece, and that's the banks. And Alexis, you talked a little bit about the banks, and I've spent a lot of time over the past couple of years looking very closely at what the banks in Greece did before the crisis and after the crisis. And I think really, in the end, it comes down, and this goes for all of Europe, but I think in Greece in particular, it comes down to the banks and what the banks are capable of doing with regard to lending and what they are willing to do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but let me just give you a sense of what I've learned just in the past year or so. I started looking at the banks in Greece about a little more than a year ago, and I was curious as to why one of the weakest banks during the crisis, a Piraeus bank, I think it was the fourth largest bank, had all of a sudden within 6 months or 8 months become the largest bank. And how does that happen? And I spent a lot of time looking at how the bank made loans and what their criteria were for its loans, looking deep into its balance sheet. And I found a bank that was very aggressive in its lending practices. And what struck me as well, it was a bank that grew very quickly, and in the end was supported via European funds. And so I guess what I was left with, not just with Piraeus, but with all the banks, is they were bailed out, about 42 billion euros, and all the management stayed in place. And the management of the top banks also had access to very attractive stock plans via warrants that made them all quite wealthy as well. So in the end, you had a banking sector that was powerful before the crisis, that in effect died during the crisis, and that reemerged more powerful after the crisis. And now as we move towards a time where there's going to be more regulation of Greek banks and European banks, the question is, how are these banks going to be regulated, and to what extent are they going to be able to lend? I just received a paper by a person I knew pretty well in Greece named Jens Bastian, and he was, I think, involved with the Troika, and he's come out with a very, very informative paper that shows and asks shows that the banks aren't lending, and then he asks why aren't the banks lending. And one of the points he makes is one we've heard before, that it's for a bank to lend to a small enterprise in Greece, it's about 6% to 9% interest rate. For a German equivalent bank, it's about half that. In an economy that is still in the midst of a recession, there is just not enough demand for lending. So you have banks that are recapitalized, more powerful than ever, but they're not lending. So I'm not really sure what the answer is. There's probably going to have to be some form of ECB intervention, political intervention. I'm not sure, but I might just stop my little spiel right now and maybe just ask you, if you came into power and you've seen how the banks have been recapitalized. They are private sector banks, even though they're owned still 87-90% by the HFSF, the sort of the bailout fund for Greece. What would your position be with regard to the banks? Would you say, okay, continue on, or would you say something different?
Alexis, you want to answer right back?
Yes. I think that it's a crucial question. I'll try to make a very simple answer in this question. If we borrow 50 billion euros to recapitalize our banks, and this account is going to be added to the total account of our debt. So if we are going to pay for this recapitalization, I think that it's very strange to keep the banks to the guys that they made them back in this bankruptcy situation. So we'll put the questions to our partners. If they will remain in the position that the Greek state will pay for the recapitalization of the banks, then the banks, I think it's very simple, and it's normally that the banks will belong to the state and not to their bankruptcy owners. If they will change opinion and they will make a deal with the next government that this account will be paid by the mechanism, the ESM, and that means that we will not have the duty to add this account to our debt. I think that then we will have the choice to give these bankruptcy banks to them, and we'll try to find a way to create new investment banks to finance our economy. But I think that it's unacceptable to pay for the banks and to not have the capacity to have the management of these banks. This is strange and unacceptable.
Can I have just a quick follow-up? That would be a radical proposition for the private sector as well as the public sector, given how sensitive Greek depositors have been and continue to be. Any suggestion about nationalizing the banks, wouldn't you worry about deposit flight? And would you consider perhaps doing what happened in Cyprus, putting in some degree of capital controls?
But what happened in Cyprus? In Cyprus, the banks didn't belong to the state,
right,
but it was private. So I think that...
but there was the panic. That was the
yes, of course. I think
Are you worried that the money would flee the system if people will say, "Oh, banks are being nationalized. That's bad news," or do you think that the reaction would be a different one?
Okay, I think that this is a danger, but we are worried if this situation will be continued, because now with this model of private banks, people are afraid that the bankers will take their homes, and I think that if we want to compare the situation is very difficult now. So I think that we'll take the risk, but I think that this will be a creative risk, because otherwise, I think that the danger of a background that you described before, it will remain if we don't do anything with the banks, and the banks belongs to their owners that they made these bubbles. And I believe that it's very simple and natural to try to make a clear deal with our partners about the capitalization of the banks. And the danger of bank run is not only a danger that the next government has to calculate, but it's a real danger already for the current situation, and we have to avoid this danger by a very carefully steps, and I think that we need a consensus with our partners to this decision, but it is unacceptable to remain in this situation.
Thank you very much. On this issue, there has been already several proposals done also at European level about, without reaching the issue of a point of nationalization, but at least to distinguish the role of the banks and to separate the let's say, speculative work of the banks from the contribution to the economy, so investment from one side and I don't know the English word, but the real separation of the yeah, exactly.
But that's not an issue for Greece because
It is an issue in the European context, though, and I think that the fact that we were never able to have a majority to do this, not at the different national level and the European level, is also something that tells us a lot about the virtual impossibility of intervening really on the banks. And that is a question that is not only a political one, but is also a financial and
Landon,
economic one.
The suggestion that we worked with in the Papandreou administration was that the financing would flow from the Europeans to the Greek government. The Greek government would then provide money to the banks in exchange for warrants.
Exactly.
And at the end of a certain period, those warrants would have the right for the Greek government to essentially call them and recoup its investment, and hopefully recoup even more than its initial investment, because it would be able to essentially call for purchase of Greek bank stock at that point at some highly elevated price. So it was a way of doing it, but under the Papademos regime, it didn't happen. So.
Yeah.
So it's been the other way around. Now the warrants were given out sort of as a reward in some ways.
Yes.
Exactly, given to the management,
Right.
not to the Greek government for providing
No,
funding.
I mean, in my mind, that was, and again, I'm going to shamelessly say that this is not, there was a very, very good paper, which I commend to all of you here, by a Greek economist named Spiros Pagratis, who early on identified this reward, which really it was, of highly leveraged warrants to all investors as an outright subsidy to management and investors and a reward for banks that blew themselves up in the first place. And he said, his point, and he can explain it better than I can, is that these were very attractive. Hedge funds, the minute they heard about it, were knocking at the door. Oh my gosh, you mean for one share I can get the opportunity to buy 7 more without having to lay out any extra money? You know, where do I sign? These were given out for free. And he could have sold, and there's a calculation that this guy made, he could have sold all of these things could have been sold in a marketplace for 3, 4, 5, 6 billion euros just within a couple of weeks. That would have gone right into the Greek treasury. So,
Thank you.
yeah, that's just one thought.
Can I ask Norman Birnbaum, Professor Emeritus, Georgetown University Law Center, to come in?
Well, look, my comment, I'm sorry I didn't get in on that Greek banking deal for my retirement, but
Other people did, Norman. It's
I'm
okay.
aware. I'm aware. I'd like to go back and try a pious footnote to my nation colleague Richard Parker's remarks on the possibility of a revival of what you broadly refer to as a left of center tradition, which presumably would incorporate social democratic and social parties and socialist parties in Europe, green parties, certainly what were very influential in the reconstruction of Europe in the subsequent decades, the social components of the Christian parties, the German Christian Democratic Union, the Italian Democrazia Cristiana, other groupings were by no means exclusively market or even predominantly market parties, even if they were culturally conservative. What would it take? And we must remember, we heard a little bit about this morning. What would it take to avoid the inheritance or the seizure of a social Europe by parties of the right, insisting on national, ethnic, regional definitions of community, putting to work in these communities certain kinds, at least, of redistribution and social legislation, but parties far from the universalist and egalitarian ethos of democracy. It has happened before. Mussolini was an ex-socialist who carried some of that, at least, into the fascist regime. I believe the correct translation of NSDAP is National Socialist German Workers' Party. And there were strong social elements in the authoritarian or semi-fascist, for instance, Polish regimes that preceded the catastrophe of 1939. Even regimes which we otherwise sometimes tend to treat with intellectual and derision and moral contempt, Vichy France, Franco Spain, had these components. So a certain amount, at least, of social solidarity, redistribution, social insurance, is by no means the exclusive property of the democratic parties of the left, and indeed at home, the tangled, complex history of American, certain varieties at least, of American populism suggests that the same phenomenon is true here. But I think that that before Europe, or if Europe is to come to the aid of Greece on a kind of platform or program you mentioned, clearly it will have to rethink the gigantic failure of education and purpose represented by the disaggregation and decomposition of the social democratic and socialist tradition. To some extent, this was, I was about to say it's possibly a result of its post-war success, but I'm not convinced that that's true. I think it was precisely because of the emphasis on the supplying of material benefits, welfare, in a very specific and quantitative sense, that some of the aspects of democratic reconstruction, which were prominent in the 40s and indeed early 50s, were to a considerable degree neglected. Workers' participation, civic education, certain kinds of communal self-regulation, matters which, for instance, in Germany, were to a certain degree seized from a somewhat moribund social democratic party by the nascent and rising Greens at the end of the 70s and 80s. And it therefore seems that it would be necessary, if Europe is to realize this solidaristic and productive potential, for it to rethink the very notion of social product. Social product is not alone, cannot alone be quantitatively measured. I'm aware that some economists have begun to study happiness. The very suggestion of the thought of it induces a profound intellectual depression, I may say so, but that's simply a disciplinary prejudice. But the notion of a social product involves also the production of the conditions of personal development, solidarity, aesthetic development, precisely those things which are often thought to be unmeasurable. And I may say the United States bears some major responsibility for encouraging the deformation of European tradition involved in what now nobody seems to mention, although it's widely practiced, the late unlamented Third Way, which was developed to some extent by Bill Clinton and sold by him, if that's the word, or pressed by him on Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder in particular. And I may add parenthetically, that is perhaps a warning for us to be a little bit cautious about hailing the possibility of a return of the Clintons to the White House as an eschatological moment. At any rate, let me conclude by saying that these European debates or these European problems seem to me to have obviously direct U.S. Analogies and analogs, particularly in the struggle within the Democratic Party to modernize, conceive of as the tradition of the New Deal, or look next door, the great society, and to wrest control of politics from a technocratic elite skimming the surface of history, skimming into several senses, let it be said. But I want to conclude with, on this note, as we consider our possible, so to speak, intellectual futures, with a note of unfortunate discouragement. The daily Politico reported the other day that the president, often off the record, converses with a gallery of persons, David Ignatius, even Charles Krauthammer amongst them, Fred Hyatt of the Washington Post editorial page. Speaking of Greece, it's a gallery that will not quite recall a Socratic gathering. That is to say, and the president even seeks to some extent, seeks their opinion, no doubt as a device for influencing the flow of opinion on the so-called opinion pages. This may have its limited efficacy or even justification. But I must say, the president went to Occidental, then to Columbia, then to Harvard. It is a curious comment on the on his view of the American universities, where splendid historians, analytical political scientists, deep philosophers, archaeologists, psychologists toil away, apparently in the hope that their colleagues will read their works, but with little purchase on politics. That seems to me, in a school of public affairs, a matter for very, very deep reflection and regret.
Thank you very much, Norman. There is one thing I want to tell you, and that is that in Europe, we don't do European debates.
In Europe, what?
We do very rarely European debates, which is actually one of the issues. One is really limited to their own national ones, and
Yes,
I
yes.
think that is one of the problems that we are really facing when trying to find European solution, and those who try to do it are either very marginalized or not really able to have an impact. And that is, I think, one of the questions that are not only economic, but also very political that we have to deal with when talking about democracy, as you, Robert, said. So we have a little bit of time, not very little, but we have some time to open a discussion and a conversation with the audience. I would regroup 3 or 4 interventions and then give back the word not to the whole panel, but to some of them, and then we go on. We have about half an hour, if I'm not wrong. It's, what? Oh, I thought it was 4:45. 15, sorry. Okay. Right, so no, I will, no, we will then proceed. We will take all the questions and then give back the floor to the panel. Okay. Yes. Wave so the microphone can walk to you.
I've got one.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead then.
Thank you. I've got the microphone, so I'm entitled to give my intervention.
Earlier, yes.
Can I just address some of the points that Alexis Tsipras was making? I would be very worried about the form and the way in which the European Union would take on redistribution in social welfare. For a very simple reason that a few years ago I was in the city of London at a meeting between investment bankers and the Hungarian Prime Minister, who was in the middle of the financial crisis and was making all sorts of promises to of austerity and deflation in his economy. And one investment banker who was rather more sensitive than perhaps many people here would expect, pointed out that his policies would give rise to actually quite a lot of poverty and unemployment in his country, to which he answered, well, that's okay, because we've got a commitment from the European Commission that they will deal with this with some kind of a social program. Yeah. In effect, this was a kind of outsourcing of social welfare, and what it highlights is actually the fact that this kind of thing needs to be introduced as part of a democratic process, and not as an excuse for introducing austerity.
Thank you. Yes. Who else wants to speak so that I know how many? Do you know? Okay. Yes, I saw him. Yes.
Thank you. Kyrios Tsipras, I fully agree with you that a significant part of the debt has to go, and not only in Greece, but in other countries too. But then the devil is in the detail, because first I wonder why this necessity has not been voiced more loudly and clearly from the countries that presently are called crisis countries. I understand why the government can't do it, but the opposition, civil society, I would have liked to hear them much more loudly proclaim this necessity. And the devil in the detail is that you just cutting the debt, depending on the creditor's volition, is not necessarily a way out. It was in '53, under American pressure, one could add, and for geopolitical reasons. But all the other international debt-cutting exercises have very often been too little and too late, and did not necessarily resolve the crisis. So what one needs is a framework that is based on debtors' rights, such as the right to have a certain amount of resources exempt from creditors, that allow keeping up a certain amount of social services, a certain amount of expenses necessary for the state and for the government. It is absolutely necessary that the creditors are no longer the ones driving the process, but that they become a party at one level, at one footing with the debtor, as is quite normally necessary. And in other words, what is necessary is, applying the standards that are generally accepted anywhere else in the case of debtors, also to the sovereign debtor, in order to protect the inhabitants of a debtor country, because they're the only ones who still suffer under debt in a way that would be unacceptable and that is against their human dignity in very many cases, and that has to stop.
Thank you.
Just an observation and a question. The discussion about banks and bank lending is exactly the same conversation that we had in the United States around TARP and the failure of the banks to do commercial lending since then. It's basically the same conversation that was had in Japan during the aftermath of the 1990s. And the banks always claim that the problem is that no one is showing up to borrow. And that just never turns out to be true, except as the consequence of the very policies that produced the problem in the first place. The question I have for the panel is, we heard from Yves Leterme at lunch today about trust. After his discussion of the way the OECD views the current economic situation, he spoke about the problem of trust. And a couple of people mentioned it on the panel, I think, the term trust. And I'm curious, how does the discussion of the trust deficit, when coming from forces aligned with the Troika, how does that sound in Greece? And what does it mean? What is the meaning of that concern? And how could it possibly be addressed?
Excellent question. Who else wants to say something? No? Alexis?
I'm going to make two comments. First of all, I'm going to absolutely agree with Mr. Parker. Is he?
He's gone.
He's gone?
He had
Okay.
the plane to get.
With what he said about the real problem, it's not only in Europe and globally, but especially in Europe. It's not only the debt crisis and the financial problem, but also democracy. I think that this is the problem. That all the decisions, the very crucial decisions, are not taken by the people, are not supported by the people, especially in European level and in European Union. And I think that this is very important that we have to discuss about our future. The European summits, the Eurogroup also, are summits between 17 prime ministers or ministers of finances that try to discuss, after the results of their past decisions, try to discuss, and at the end of the day, the decisions is what Mrs. Merkel or Mr. Schäuble want to do. I think that this is the crucial problem in Europe. And I think that after all these years of the crisis and the bad results, we have to take some to understand that it's very difficult to go ahead without changing the rules, without give the opportunity to the European Parliament to take the decisions. Because if we don't try to avoid this situation, if we don't try to overcome this situation, I think it will be very difficult for Europe to overcome the crisis. Even though I think that we have common interests and we have common reasons to overcome the crisis, because I think that we have to realize that after 5 consecutive years of recession in the south, especially in Greece, and 3 years of implementation of this bad medicine, the medicine of austerity, the patient became worse. So the recipe was worse than the illness itself. But at the same time, as Mr. Latarme said, from the 17 leaders of European Eurozone countries, only 2 remains in their position, Mrs. Merkel and who else? I don't know who. No, he's not still. Just one, so just one. So it's a success story for Mrs. Merkel, but it's a disaster story for all the others. Secondly, I wanted to mention to comment that in Greece, Mr. Papandreou, when he was prime minister, I think that he didn't try to negotiate. He made the decisions first, and then he thought about the results. That's why he didn't manage to handle this crisis. And I think that neither the other governments in Greece after PASOK government tried to negotiate at the European level. Because negotiation means that you have red lines. You will have red lines, not to accept everything that your partners says. And
what's the leverage, though? Sorry to interrupt, but if you're negotiating, you need leverage, right?
Yes.
What would your leverage be? I mean, what's the weapon? Yeah.
I think that the bigger weapon is the supporting of your people. I believe that Eurozone is like a chain with 17 links. If one link will break, of course it will be very bad event for the link that will be broken, but at the same time the chain will be collapsed. So I think that this is the great weapon that we have, even though we are a very small country in the periphery. You said before that Greek debt is only the 2% of the European debt. And we have to understand that in reality, Greek debt is about 300 billion euros. At the same time, the Italian debt is 2 trillion euros. So I think that the crucial point is that, and I believe, absolutely believe in that, if one can't go out of the Eurozone, the markets will try to ask who's the next. And I think that this is the great weapon that we have. And the second weapon is that we could propose, we could put on the table a win-win viable solution for the salvation, not only for Greece, but for the Eurozone as a whole. And this solution is to reconstruct the periphery debt, is to try to make a decision for growth, and that means investments. I think that we have to be wiser for our common history, and that was the conference in 1953, that the decision that taken in London in 1953 was the reason for the growth miracle of Germany and for Europe after the Second World War. So I think that democracy is the victim of the memorandum, the first victim, and of course social cohesion and society and people that now are under humanitarian crisis are the victims that needs emergency help and emergency solution to this problem. So it was a question that
I think he asked about trust. Yeah.
Yes, this is a very crucial question. You know that nowadays, not only in Greece, but all over Europe, I think that the political system is under trust crisis. There is no credibility. Nobody trusts anyone. And I think that the only way to change this situation is to reinforce democracy. And secondly, is to understand who works for whom. For example, Troika came to Greece. They had some ideas about the solution of our problem. The results are very bad. Now everybody understands that the internal devaluation is a failure story, but I don't want to stay in this. I also want to add that it's impossible that these guys, after 3 years that they are in Greece, they don't understand what happened in Greece and who made money with this situation and who maintain to make money with this situation. So I believe that Troika don't want to change the corruption situation in the political system in Greece. And this is the crucial point. So if they did they made just decisions, even though their wrong program of the internal devaluation, I think that the citizens will have some kind of trust in the governments and in the European institutions. But I think that it's very clear for everybody that their intention is not to handle the crisis. The austerity is not their mean to overcome the crisis. The austerity is their goal. And also their goal is to keep the power in the oligarchy, in a few people that had the power all the last year in Greece, and they made that they made. And I think this is also a very big problem, not only our differences in the economical program, but also our huge differences in the moral, in the ethical, in, how can I say, in the moral level. This is the trust crisis that you said, and I think that you were correct.
Thank you. You want to add anything?
Yeah, let me just follow up on that question. I mean, you would talk about nationalizing and this failure of trust and then the sort of the old guard continuing to remain in charge. And again, we're talking about the banks. If, for example, the Troika had said, okay, we're going to recapitalize the banks, but all of the management must be changed and there must be new management, would you still accept that these banks could be private sector banks under new management, or would you still insist that the banks must belong to the state?
As I said before, my answer, it depends on the dealing between the Greek government and our partners about this account of 50 billion euros that I'm not sure if will be 50 billions or more, that have to do with the recapitalization of the banks. If this account will be added to the total debt of Greece, so if this billion of the recapitalization will be paid by the Greek citizens, then I think that it's very normal that will have...
It's actually paid by the European citizens, I mean, in effect, because it's the European money that's being in.
Yes, but we borrow money. They don't make a gift, these accounts to Greece.
No, it's not a gift.
They borrow money. This is loans, and we have to repay our loans.
No, that's true. That's true.
So I think that the answer is very clear in this one.
Yanis, briefly.
Coming very quickly on this. My answer to you, Landon, is if the ESM is prepared to accept that the 50 billion is not going to count against Greek
Exactly.
Right.
and they want to change the board of directors, they can do anything they want. That will be perfectly fine. But what I suppose Alexis is arguing is that you can't have that debt being transferred onto the books of the Greek national government, and at the same
There's
time
loans to be
maintain
prepared.
the same management and the same correct practices, which you know better than anybody else in this room.
No,
And crucial question, Thomas, is what the U.S. administration did with the bankruptcy banks in U.S. They didn't nationalize them?
Well, I mean, let me just back up.
But of course, after that, they...
I mean, there was
they
new money put, I mean, some management was changed. Everyone took money whether they liked it or not. Some banks became wards of the state or some institutions, but some management was left in place. Well, Jamie Dimon took capital, but he stayed in power. Lloyd Blankfein, for example, took capital. But AIG, that was different. So I think, you know, it's a very, you know, in my opinion, when a bank messes up and needs money at that scale, management needs to change. I mean, that's just sort of, I think, a basic principle of bailout 101. But when I did ask the Troika about why, given all these investments, their point sort of across the board was that it wasn't the banks, that this is a problem that the sovereign had. This is the fault of the Greek state, not of the banks. The banks were in okay shape, and that they had been, you know, they'd suffered as a result of PSI and all that, which I yeah, I agree. I think that's a misleading and a disingenuous response. But I think I do understand where they're coming from, because they don't want to be seen as meddlers and sort of picking this person over that person. They don't. The last thing they want to do is get involved in local Greek politics and sort of who's going to be the right person for this kind of bank. They just want stability, and if it means that the person running the show is probably not the ideal person, but it's going to result in a more stable financial system. That's their bottom line. I mean, that's pretty much what they've said. But I agree that there are a lot of questions that, I mean, that are outstanding. And it seems to me that the government has more or less taken a pass on getting involved in this, because actually I'm not really quite sure, because they have, I think it's a pretty fair point that if we're going to take on 50 billion euros of debt, that we should have we should be able to say whether or not we want to keep management, and maybe the government wants to keep the current management. It's not clear. So,
Norman, you wanted to say something?
Well, I want to thank our honored guests from Greece for seeing and talking about the ways in which the essential problem is not perhaps the technical distribution of solutions to the finance market, but the problem of finding a democratic path to the control of the economy and therefore of our common life. And since this is, I'd like to take the liberty of pointing out this year is the 100th anniversary of the birth of a great European who had considerable involvement with Greece, namely Willy Brandt. Who was a great European and a great internationalist. And it's interesting, when Brandt took over the chancellorship in 1969, there was a striking phrase in his inaugural address to the Bundestag, mehr Demokratie wagen, let us dare more democracy. And it seems to me that this is a thought which across boundaries might well be considered.
Thank you very much. Alexis, do you want to add something?
I think that it's time to,
okay.
to go
also, because I think that we will have time tomorrow to go back to some of these questions, notably on the issue of democracy, because if we intend democracy simply as elections, I think we are heading democratically towards an anti-European European Parliament. So I think that this issue of democracy is really has to be taken into account, not only as procedures, but also as way of convincing to go towards certain lines that are certainly the ones that we have described today, because otherwise, if it simply stick to the question of elections, I'm not sure we are going to have positive solutions to the European problems, or at least this is my opinion. So I want to thank you, everybody. I think that we did have some hints about what kind of alternative for Greece are open, and thereby also some alternative for Europe. And perhaps also some ideas about the fact that perhaps the concept of periphery when we are talking about the European crisis is not the most appropriate one, who knows? And we are certainly going on with this conversation tomorrow, and I thank you very much for your attention and for your patience to having been with us this afternoon and this morning. Thank you.